So let's look at these. As I say, 4 domains or 4 different aspects. So the personal relationship aspect is all about, as individuals, who do we know and what do we do to establish relationships with individuals and maintain them. Social network support is partly who might help us if we need additional help, but also the other side of it is what can we and what do we do for others. So the sort of it's a two-way thing there. The civic engagement is things like political participation, things like volunteer activities, various forms of community action. You might once a year clean up your neighbourhood. 10 of you get together and get probably doesn't happen in Japan, but supermarket trolleys, do they ever get thrown into water courses? They just wouldn't happen in Japan. But in England, it's sort of seen as entertaining to throw a supermarket trolley in a canal or whatever. So you might, as a group, get together and say, right, we're going to clean this stretch of canal. Things like that. That would be a community action. And the final category is trust and values that are beneficial to society as a whole. Beneficial because with trust, it's easier to cooperate. And the idea is the more cooperation we have, the more benefit we get. So let's just look at some of these figures. Now, of course, I'm sure some of these questions are also asked in Japan, and it would have been very enlightening to put the percentage response for Japan alongside. Unfortunately, my Japanese is not up to it, but you might like to consider to what extent you're surprised by these percentages or not. So the first one's to do with personal relationships. I almost feel sad just reading the first one. Proportion of people who have at least one close friend. 97%. I thought that was high, actually. But anyway. Proportion of people who meet socially with friends, relatives or work colleagues at least once a week. Quite high, 61%. Feelings of loneliness often or always. Now remember, we're trying to measure here, or we're claiming to measure social capital. But to what extent is feelings of loneliness often or always, is that really social capital? Or is it, I mean, that could be an aspect of mental health and so on.
So how to define often or always? How to define frequency?
I don't believe they specify it. They leave it to the individual to interpret often or always. Well, always is always, I guess. But often, I agree. I'm not quite sure. I have no idea. If I was responding to that question, well, I'm not often lonely, so I can't. Well, I'm never lonely, so I can't. I haven't a clue what goes into people's heads. It's a good point. You know, this information, if we're going to interpret it, we have to sort of have some understanding or view about what people think when they're completing these questions. So I don't know about often, sorry. A proportion of people who have used the internet for social networking in the last 3 months. And the final one, proportion of people who regularly stop and talk with people in the neighbourhood. That's quite an interesting one, because you know the way modern world goes, particularly in some countries, in some cities, you almost not encouraged to stop and talk. Anyway, that's 68%. But just keeping in mind, these things, which in principle are sort of measurable, because they're questions you can ask and people will give you an answer, the idea is, hardly needs to be said, the higher these are, apart from this one, the lower this one is, that's indicative of more social capital. Support networks. Percentage of people that have a spouse or partner, family member or friend to rely on a lot if they have a serious problem. I find this quite encouraging. So this is the figure for It was probably UK-wide, this one, 84%. Proportion of parents who regularly receive or give practical or financial help from or to a child aged 16 or over not living with them. Well, you can see what it's getting at, you know. You had a child, they're now grown up a bit, they're not living with you. To what extent are they helping you, are you helping them? But is that really something to do with social capital? Again, it's difficult. Proportion of people who borrow things and exchange favours with their neighbours, 42%. Presumably it's a part of the 68 in the previous one who spoke to their neighbours. Civic engagement. Volunteering. Now, proportion of people who volunteered more than once in the last 12 months. So this could be 19% just volunteered once, but this 19% might have been doing it every month. So it's quite possibly insensitive measure. I guess the people who are more supportive of these measures will emphasise they're asking the same questions of broadly the same people year after year. And so it's not the sort of 19% that matters here. It's how does that compare to previous years? And it's not one measure at a time. It's, is there a trend across most measures of increasing or decreasing social capital? Voter turnout in the general election. This won't work in Australia. In Australia, you get fined if you don't vote. Is it voluntary in Japan? Yeah. Proportion of people who have been involved in at least one political action in the previous 12 months. What's that? Theresa May comes on the screen and I say something, oh, that wonderful woman, or the opposite. Is that a political action? Now this is almost the politicians want to know how popular they are. Proportion of people who are very or quite interested in politics. I'm surprised it's 56% in Britain. It's only just below the election turnout. This is very or quite interested. Anyway, and the final group was this trust and cooperative norms. I like this one. Percentage of those who have trust in the national government, 35%. Now I'm quite sure it must be higher in Japan. Proportion of people who would say that most people can be trusted, I don't think it was a typo, I think I double checked it, I think it's also 35%. But an interesting one here, proportion of people who say that most people in their neighbourhood can be trusted. And it comes back to this thing, if you're in a neighbourhood, you almost are taking part because you proximity, and so you sort of know people regardless. Other things, you have to step outside to get to know them. And so we don't trust people in general, but people in our neighbourhood, because of the proximity and that opportunity for trust to develop, we trust them much more. Proportion of people who definitely agree or tend to agree that their local area is a place where people from different backgrounds get on well together. I found this very encouraging, and it sits very uncomfortably with a vote for Brexit. So 89% of people definitely agree or tend to agree that there are local places where different people from different backgrounds get on together. So why on earth do a majority vote essentially for much more restrictive immigration policies? Then we get on to sort of crime one here. Do you feel it's fairly safe or very safe walking alone after dark? And then we've got a male-female answers. That's a bit worrying, but that again, remember this is UK. I'm anticipating in Japan this would be higher, no, the same?
Higher.
Yeah. So you get the flavour of it. Now there's different ways of asking these questions, there's different questions you can ask, but virtually all measures of social capital fall into this sort of category. They're either asking people about their beliefs, or they're asking about their participation in groups or networks. And sometimes that might be within the family, sometimes it might be neighbourhood, sometimes it might be more broadly.